is up, YouTube? How is everybody doing tonight? JD Phillips here from the Appalachian Storyteller, and I'm going to be hanging out with you guys for 2 hours tonight, live, telling some of my favorite stories and playing some music for you guys. So if you would, please hit that like button and share this stream to help people who don't know anything about this channel find their way home to the home of all things Appalachia. We want to start things off tonight with a video that I just released 2 days ago, and this is about the Appalachian coal miner. Now, we've all heard stories of the coal miner and had a view of what their life might have been like and seen pictures of them. But recently I was in a library and I was doing some research, and I came across a man's diary, and I read it in his own words, what it was like to be a coal miner in 1902. And there were a lot of things happening in 1902. For one, the biggest coal mining strike in the history of America. Up to that point, 147,000 coal miners were getting ready to go on strike. And this fella didn't know what to do. He was making $17 a month, and that's all the money he had to support the 6 people in his family. And he was fretting, what should he do? He was going to risk it all and go and strike, or should he keep on going to the mines? What would you do? That's a pretty tough decision when you start talking about your family, and that was the only job that there was. Well, let's see what happened. Stay tuned.
The year is 1902, and I'm 35 years old. I'm married and the father of 4 children, and I've lived all my life in the West Virginia coal region. For 23 of those years, I've been working in and around the mines. You might say I was destined for a life of coal dust. My father was a miner too, and he died 10 years ago from miner's asthma. All 3 of my brothers are miners. None of us had any opportunities to get an education. I mean, we all went to school till we were about 12 years old, and then we were put into the screen room of a breaker to pick slate. From there, we went inside the mines as driver boys, and as we grew stronger, we were taken on as laborers, where we served until we were able to call ourselves miners. We were given the work in the coal mines and the seams and the gangways. However, one of them now lies in the cemetery. 50 tons of top rock dropped on him. He was killed 3 weeks after he got his job as a miner, just a month before he was to be married. In the 15 years that I've worked as a miner, I've earned an average rate that most of the coal heavers get. Today, I'm little better off than when I started. I've got $100 to my name, but I'm not in debt, and I hope to be able to weather the upcoming strike without going hungry. I'm only one of the hundreds of striking miners that you see on the street every day. The muscles on my arms are no harder. The calluses on my palms are no deeper than my neighbors whose entire life has been spent in the coal region. If you go by years, I'm only 35. But if you go by the looks of the marks on my body, or the looks of the lines of worriment on my forehead, or the gray hairs in my head and on my mustache, you'll think I'm 10 years older. You need not wonder why. You see, day in and day out, from Monday morning through Saturday evening, between the rising and the setting of the sun each day, I'm underground working in the coal mines. From the seams, water trickles into ditches along the gangways, and if it's not water, it's the gas that hurls us to eternity, and the props and the timbers into a chaos. Our daily life is not a pleasant one. When we put on our oil-soaked suits in the morning, we can't guess all the dangers which threaten our lives. We walk sometimes miles to the mouth of the shaft, on the top of the slope, to that black hole that awaits each of us. One by one, we enter the darkened chambers of the mines. On our right and on our left, we see the logs that keep the top and support the sides that might crush us into a shapeless matter, as they've done to so many of our comrades. We get old quickly. Powder, smoke, after damp, bad air. Oh, they all combined to bring the lines on our faces and the asthma to our lungs. Now, I don't strike because I want to. I struck because I had to. A miner, the same way as any other workman, must earn fair wages or he can't live. And it's not how much you get that counts. It's how much what you get will buy. And I've gone through it all, and I think my case is a good one. I was married in 1890 when I was 23 years old, quite above the age when us miner boys get into double hardness. The woman I married is like myself. She was born beneath the shadow of a dirt bank. Her chances for school weren't any better than mine, but she did have to learn how to keep house on a certain amount of money. After we paid the preacher for tying the knot, we had just $185 in cash. But we had the good health and the good wishes of many of our friends to start us off. Our cash was quickly exhausted in buying furniture for housekeeping. By 1890, the work wasn't as plentiful, and by the time our first baby came, there was room for much doubt as to how we would pull it out. There was low wages and not much over half-time to work during those years, and it made us hustle. In the year of 1891, I earned $368. That represented 12 months of work, or an average of $30 a month. But our rent was $10 a month, and we never owed the company store less than $20. And then I had to buy all my oil suits and gum boots. The result was that after the first year and a half of our married life, we were in debt. Not much, of course, not as much as many of my neighbors, men who had larger families, some who made less money, or in whose case there had been sickness, or an accident, or death. These are all things that a miner must account and pay for. I mean, I've had fairly good work since I was married. I've pretty much made the average of what contract miners are paid, but as I've said before, I ain't much better off than when I started. In 1896, my wife was sick for 11 weeks. The doctor came to my house almost every day, and he charged me $20 for his services. And then there was medicine to buy. I paid the drugstore $18. My wife's mother nursed her, and we had to keep a girl in the kitchen for $1.50 a week, which cost me $15 over a 10-week span. And this was on top of all the additional living expenses. In 1897, we were only working half-time, and in the fall, one of my brothers struck a gas feeder. Oh, there was a terrible explosion. He was hurled downward into a pit and covered with a rush of coal and rock. I was only working a short distance away from him, and for a moment, I was unable to realize what had happened. Myself and 100 others were soon at work, and in a short while we had found him, horribly burned over his whole body, and his assistant was dead right next to him. Now he was my brother. He was single, and he had been bored, and he didn't have a home of his own, and I didn't want to take him to the hospital, so I directed the driver of the ambulance to take him to my house. Besides being burned, his right arm and his left leg were broken, and he was hurt internally. The doctors, there were 2 of them at my house by the time we got there. They said he would die, but somehow he didn't, and he's still living and a coal miner today. But he laid in that bed for just over 14 weeks, and he was unable to work for 7 weeks after he got out of the bed. He had no money, and all of his expenses for doctors and medicine and the extra help were taken care of by me, except for $25, which one of my other brothers gave. My last brother, he didn't have anything to give. Poor work, low wages, and a sickly wife kept him scratching for his own family. To me, it was nonsense to say that I should have sent him to the hospital or a government facility. Heck, we're American citizens, and we don't go to hospitals or poorhouses begging for charity. Now, let me tell you how things are today, or as they were before this strike started. My current wages were $29.47 for the last 2 weeks of work, sun up to sundown, at the rate of $58.94 a month. But my rent, it's $10.50 a month, and our coal that we use to burn costs another $4 a month. We burn over a ton each month, and on average, that costs us $3 a ton, When it comes down to groceries, this is where you get hit the hardest. Everybody knows the cost of living has been extremely high all winter. Butter has been 38 cents a pound. Eggs are as high as 32 cents a dozen. Ham is 16 cents a pound. The potatoes are all the way up to $1. And cabbage, you can't find it for less than a cent a pound. Anyhow, my company store bill for 2 weeks was $11, and that makes $22 a month. On top of that, the butcher gets $6 a month. All in all, it costs me, just to live, $42.50. That leaves me $17 a month to keep my family in clothes, to pay my church dues, and to keep my insurance going. Heck, my insurance costs me another $2.20 a month. I find it ironic that the coal owners never allow the stable boss to cut the amount of fodder for their mules. No, he insists that so many quarts of oats and corn be added to the meal and so much hay each evening. That's right, he keeps his mule fat and fed. Us miners, on the other hand, we're taken advantage of in every way. Now you must consider that I'm a contract miner, and my earnings are more than about 3/4 of the other fellas at the same mine. However, even my paycheck could be $7 less next month. It may be true that in the days of individual operation, the cost per ton of mining coal was less than it is today, but it's not right that the entire increase of cost of mining should be charged to the miner. That's what's being done now, and all of these reductions come out of our wages. I mean, the miners, we don't participate in setting the high prices of coal. Now, our bosses, they try to prove otherwise by juggling with figures and manipulating math, but they're proving it's struck a fault, and the drill shows no coal in their argument. Meanwhile, over 1/2 the price paid per ton of coal in New York or Philadelphia goes into the pocket of the mine owner. We all know that the price of coal has advanced in the past 20 years. We also know that wages are less and the cost of living is higher. And I remember a time when I was just a young lad. My father used to get his coal for $1 a ton, but now I pay $3. Our condition can't be any worse, and it has to get better. We're not asking for the luxuries of the rich. We don't want silk and laces for our wives and our daughters, but we must have butter for our bread and meat for our soup, and we'd like to earn enough to buy a clean shirt every once in a while. Our sons are not expecting automobiles and membership cards in the clubs of every city, but they want their fathers to earn enough to keep them in school until they have a reasonably fair education. This has been my life as a coal miner. I've given everything, and my family has nothing. On May 12, 1902, Thomas Wilson joined 147,000 other coal miners in one of the largest strikes in American history. In previous strikes, the United States government would send in troops to support the coal cartels and force the workers back into the mines. However, 1902 was different, and Thomas Theodore Roosevelt became the first president in history to show sympathy and to support the workers. After 162 days, the strike was over, with the coal miners earning shorter working days and a 10% raise.
I told you that was a heck of a story, right? Well, let's keep it going. The next video I'm going to show you is about a war, the last American war that happened on American soil, and it happened right here in East Tennessee. It's called the Coal Creek War. It's a heck of a story. Where are you going, my little man? Crossing the mountain with that gun in your hand. Well, I'm gonna join the miners in the Coal Creek town. Gonna light a torch and burn the stockade down. Well, the soldiers are coming from near and far. Gonna take a part in the Coal Creek War. Gonna take a part in the Coal Creek War, yeah. Coal Creek War. Check this out. This is a heck of a story. I'll see you guys in just a second.
I'm gonna join the miners in the Coal Creek town. We're gonna light a torch and burn the stockade down. The soldiers are coming from near and far. Gonna take a part in the Coal Creek War. Gonna take a part in the Coal Creek War.
It might come as a surprise, but one of the last wars ever fought on American soil happened right here in Anderson County in East Tennessee. That's right, and this story has got it all. Everything from government corruption and greed to slavery, the right to bear arms, or David versus Goliath. It was a classic case of the common man versus the United States government. You see, by the conclusion of the Civil War, both politicians and wealthy businessmen had learned that there were deep veins of coal and iron ore in the mountains of East Tennessee, and they began purchasing hundreds of acres of land and began mining operations, hiring hundreds of local folks to work in these mines. And when you think about it, these were the first real jobs to come to these remote mountains. Folks living here had always made their own clothes, their own furniture and housing. They worked the ground for all their food. But now, these coal mining companies, they had set up company stores with all sorts of goods that miners could purchase by working in these mines. Sugar, clothing, furniture, whiskey, you name it. And the miners did. In fact, most of these miners actually ended up with huge amounts of debts to these company stores that they could never repay. And this meant that they could never stop working for these mines. It was a vicious cycle, and the mining companies had them right where they wanted them. Coal miners in Tennessee usually weren't union members, but they would still strike or walk off the job if they thought their wages were being cut or the working conditions were too bad. Tennessee's state government, which had been deeply in debt after the Civil War, had started the practice of renting out prisoners for mining companies to use. It brought in money for the state, and it reduced labor costs for these companies, who could rent convicts cheaper from what they could pay their workers. And as you might imagine, folks started getting sent to prison for little to no reason to provide this labor. However, in 1891, a Briceville mining company brought these convicts to replace some striking miners. That's right, prisoners were forced to mine the coal mines for free, while the mining company padded the pockets of the Tennessee government. They fired all their paid employees. The 300 miners that were fired were furious. So they gathered every pistol, every shotgun or rifle that they could muster, and they surrounded the stockade that was holding the convicts and their guards, and they demanded that they surrender. When the guards finally surrendered, the miners put all of the convicts and guards on a train and sent them back to Knoxville. Now wait a minute. Do you think the politicians who were getting filthy rich were just going to sit back and let these Appalachian hillbillies ruin it all? No, not a chance. Tennessee Governor John Buchanan called out the state militia and personally led all of the prisoners back into Briceville, and it was just another case of the U.S. government using the military against its own people. But you see, these mountain folks were stubborn, and they were slow to quit when they believed in what they were fighting for. And let's face it, they were fighting for their families. After the governor left, the miners again took over to the stockade, and this time shipped the state militia members back to Knoxville along with the guards and the prisoners. They sent a message to the governor: "We struggle for the right to earn bread by honest labor, and we are opposed to the system of labor that may be invoked in our degradation." This time, the Tennessee governor promised the miners that the state legislature would hold a special session to consider outlawing convict labor leases. Instead, the legislature passed a law making it illegal for the miners to interfere with the convict lease system. This move by the Tennessee government resulted in an all-out war. Miners from all over the Appalachian Mountains learned about what the government was doing. They all decided to join together and form their own army against the Tennessee government. Miners from Kentucky, Virginia, and all over East Tennessee brought every weapon that they owned, and they marched into Briceville and declared war. For 2 years, they burned stockades, they freed prisoners, they had battles with the state militia. Gunfire echoed through the mountains, day and night, for 2 years. This caused massive problems for the politicians, because while they were making $75,000 a year by leasing out these prisoners, they were now spending over $200,000 a year just to fight this war. Now, isn't that something? The politicians were actually losing money, and lots of it, but they had to be sure that any American uprising against their thievery was punished. And at this point, that's all this war was about: the common man versus the government. Now, Tennesseans didn't care too much about convicts, but they did tend to sympathize with the miners, and so labor groups held rallies in the largest cities for the coal miners, and others sent the miners aid. Finally, the Tennessee's government had had enough. In 1893, the state abolished the convict lease system. This entire event in history is important, and one we should never forget. Next time someone suggests that Americans give up their right to bear arms, or that we should just trust the government, tell them this story about the Coal Creek War.
Where are you going, my little man? Crossing the mountain with that gun in your hand. I'm gonna join the miners in the Coal Creek town. We're gonna light a torch and burn the stockade down. The soldiers are coming from near and far, gonna take a part in the Coal Creek War. Gonna take a part in the Coal Creek War.
Hey guys, welcome back. JD Phillips from the Appalachian Storyteller. Hope you guys are enjoying the show tonight. Be sure to hit the like button there and share this out to help people find this in the YouTube algorithm. Thanks so much for your support tonight. I appreciate all you guys that support this channel and support me. Your love for Appalachian history. I really appreciate you guys so much. I'm going to play a little bit of one of my favorite songs here. Almost heaven, West Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountain and the Shenandoah River. Life is old here, older than the trees, younger than the mountains, blowing like a breeze. Country roads take me home to the place where I belong. West Virginia, Mountain Mama, take me home. Country roads. You know, a lot of times the stories that I tell on this channel are from literally riding down country roads and back roads and things like that. And about a year ago, I was riding through, I think I was somewhere outside of Grainger County up towards Bean Station. I don't even know what county that is, honestly, but we were riding back through there, and I came across this gorgeous log cabin. And when I saw it, I literally turned around on a 2-lane highway, literally turned around and went back. And when I got there, I saw a guy in the back, and he was tilling a garden. And I was taking some photos of the cabin. And he came up, and we started talking, and I asked him if he'd let me do a story on his cabin. And I tell you what a nice guy. I haven't met too many people like Mr. Ray, and he gave me a complete tour of 2 cabins that he's restoring, and it is a really cool story. lots of history in these cabins that he saved, and we need more people like him. I hope you guys check this video out, and I hope you like it. This is Appalachian log cabins and the stories that they can tell.
One of the things I love the most about riding through rural Appalachia is looking at the old barns and homesteads sitting quietly in the shadows of the mountains. Especially when I run across an old cabin from the 1800s. I always ponder the history and I wonder what stories the walls could tell. Sometimes I'll even pull into the gravel or dirt driveway to get a closer look. I'm always curious to know who is the keeper of these cabins, who's the one protecting them from disappearing and being lost forever to the hands of time. And sometimes I get lucky enough to sit down for a long chat with the owner of the cabins. Well, today was one of those days, and I got to learn the incredible story of two cabins with two separate histories. One was once a homestead for a family of 13 who worked the fields in these mountains. And the other was built by Indians back in 1818 when East Tennessee was still controlled by Native Americans.
With us today.
I'm glad to tell the story.
So this cabin we're standing in here, how did it get here?
Okay, well, my dad, Bob Ray, was a highway patrolman here in this county. And in the late 1970s, he heard about this cabin. It was in West Hamlin County, the west of Morristown. And the story is that the property where this cabin stood was sold. And the new owners had no connection to this old cabin, which was behind the farmhouse, the new house, and had been deserted for years. The new people, having no connection to the cabin, just wanted to get rid of it. They were going to burn it or bury it. My dad heard about it and said, listen, I would love to have the cabin. I'll get it off your hands. You won't have to do anything. And they said, fine. So Dad dismantled this cabin. We took these logs and stored them where I grew up, which was about 3 miles up the road here, in a barn. These logs just sat for 30 years. And one day, about 10 years ago, my dad, who was getting older, we were coming up the driveway there, and he said, Rob, I'd like to put that old cabin up. I'm getting older. I'd like to see that put back together. I said, well, let's just do it. We don't know. We don't know who originally built it. We think that it goes back to the 1850s. The fellow that helped us put it back together knew a lot about these old cabins, and based on, I don't know, the dovetailing and the type of, I don't know, he thought it went back to the 1850s. Mm-hmm. We don't know who built it, but we do know this old couple right up here in that picture above the fireplace. Mm-hmm. Those folks lived in this cabin around the turn of the century, the early 1900s. Okay. I've got a picture somewhere of those two old folks and their entire family, which consisted of 13 people. 13 folks lived in this cabin. Wow. And I've got a picture of the whole family on the porch of this cabin around 1903. Okay. And so can you imagine this room, and of course there's a room up above, 13 people living in this cabin. Wow. That's incredible. Yeah. And it's mostly original. We had to replace some logs, and you can kind of tell the difference. These are original logs, and then you look over there, and it has a different kind of look to it. Those are replacement logs. Okay. This section of floor right here, we wanted to preserve everything we could. We had enough boards to do this part of the floor. The upstairs floor is original. The staircase is original, and it's just as solid as the day it was built. And in fact, you see those flowers over there that looks like a kid painted them? Yeah. We even know who painted those flowers. We got to meet the granddaughter of these two folks, and they remembered this cabin. And they said that in that picture, the smallest girl, who was about 3 years old in the picture, was the artist of the family. And they said that she was probably the little girl that painted those flowers.
How about that?
So,
Indeed. What a great story. Just imagine for a moment what it would be like to live with 13 people in this cabin. It's an inspiring story to see that Mr. Ray and his father took such care in preserving this 170-year-old cabin. And others began to notice as well. Soon, Mr. Ray was gifted a 200-year-old cabin built by Native Americans. Mr. Ray tells us the story.
now this one is all original. In fact, I even kept the rock that was underneath it. All right, this cabin we've just put up within the last couple of years. And Avondale is a community about 3 miles west of here, down 11W. And 100 years ago, it was a little resort community. They had a hotel, it was all about the mineral water.
There was mineral water.
Yeah, the mineral water. And of course, 100 years ago, everybody thought the mineral water would cure everything that ails you. So people would flock to these areas to vacation, but mainly to drink the water. And this cabin, which was called the Indian cabin, was on that property. And they called it the Indian cabin because it was built during the Indian reign. And
when do you think it was built?
well, 1818. We've got postcards of Avondale Springs, and the postcards I have are probably 100 years old. And in these postcards are pictures of this cabin. And on the postcards, it refers to it again as the Indian cabin, built in 1818. So it just turned 200 years old. We know it was originally built as a church, and then it's been used for about 20 years as a school, one-room schoolhouse, and it's been lived in by lots of different folks over the last 200 years. Tennessee became a state in 1796,
So 20 years
20
or
years
so.
after statehood. Yeah.
Wow. And built by Indians when the area was probably still wild.
Yeah. The Cherokee weren't moved out till the 1830s. So a lot of history right here.
I'm sure glad that I took a chance and pulled into that driveway. I had no idea that I would have the pleasure of meeting Mr. Ray or listening to the incredible story of these two cabins. On behalf of all of us who care about Appalachian history and preserving these buildings, thank you, Mr. Ray. Thanks for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel, where I share all sorts of Appalachian history and storytelling. Till next time, my friends.
Hey guys, welcome back. JD Phillips here from the Appalachian Storyteller. Hope you guys are enjoying just hanging out and listening to these stories and getting some background history on them, and even enjoying a tune or two. This next video, my wife wanted to drive to New York City, and we were going there, and I was like, what if we just take a back road for 2 days? Let's just take a back road. And so we did, and we went all the way across the Great Smoky Mountains, and and at that point we just started taking back roads. The next thing we knew, we found ourselves in Carroll County, Virginia. And I was filming a lot of things there, and I ended up at the courthouse, where I stumbled upon a story that has pretty much been forgotten, and it's 1912, and it was the #1 story on the newspapers all across the world. and was destined to be a story that was going to be remembered forever. But then something happened. Something big happened. The Titanic sunk, and it knocked this story off the front page. And so pretty much it was it's a lost story. But the more I got to digging in on it, I was like, this story, it's got to be told. This story is incredible. People need to know about this story. It's mind-blowing. And because a lot of times people talk about Appalachian clans, and naturally, the first thing everybody thinks about is the Hatfields and the McCoys. But the reality is there were so many clans out there. And the Allen clan, the Allen family clan in Virginia, man, what a family. What a family. And love them or hate them, these old boys didn't mess around. And the law was afraid of them. The justice system was afraid of them. The government, everybody was afraid of these guys. And finally, it was all political, and it came down to a showdown in the courtroom that would end up being the deadliest day in the American justice system. So I put this story out there, and I was blown away at the response. Over 1.2 million people have watched this story from all over the world. And I've been contacted by historians and screenwriters and things like that. There's talk that this is actually maybe going to be a movie, which is kind of cool. I'm not going to get any money out of it because, I mean, it's a historical event. Which is a shame, but I wrote this one song for the video. It's a song I call "From the Inside," and so when you watch this video, listen for this song. And I hope that if they do make a movie out of it, it would be really cool if they would at least include this song. So this is called "From the Inside." Here we go. From the Inside, and this is from the most popular video on my channel, 1.2 million viewers, and this is called Appalachia's Deadliest Family. Hope you enjoy it.
Back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, you might say Appalachia was a lawless frontier that was ruled by powerful family clans. Sure, there were sheriffs and judges, but they held little authority over the heavily armed Appalachian families that were led by quick-tempered, pistol-carrying, brawny men who would lash out in violence at the drop of a hat. In fact, the law feared these families. By 1910, You might say there were two dueling legal systems in these rugged mountains. On one hand, you had outlaw Appalachian justice, where men took matters into their own hands, and bloodshed was the only way to solve a dispute with another man. On the other hand, the courts were ran by elected politicians and career law officers who tried to impose law and order by arresting lawbreakers and depended on the courts to impose prison sentences. It was only a matter of time before these two systems would clash. And in 1912, they did. And what happened next is still considered the deadliest courtroom shootout in the history of America. And it happened right here in Appalachia. So, with that, my friend, this is the true story of the 1912 Courthouse Massacre. It all started on a Saturday night in the fall of 1911 at a corn husking gathering in rural Virginia. You see, shucking corn during harvest was a big event in the mountains, and the process could be very work-intensive. Sometimes, a farmer would ease his burden by inviting his neighbors over. All the men and the boys would sit outside and shuck corn, while the women prepared the food. And the girls would help with the food, or they would practice quilting. It was a time of socializing. The boys and the girls loved to play the game Shake the Cat, where they bounced a cat on a quilt. Each of the four corners was held by a girl, and a boy would throw a cat on the quilt while the girls bounced the quilt. And whichever direction the cat ran determined what girl the boy could kiss. Meanwhile, out on the porch, the older boys and men would hold contests to see who could shuck a bushel of corn the fastest. Every now and then, they would find an ear of corn that would have some red in it, and it was called a red ear. The tradition was that if a young man discovered a red ear of corn, he could kiss a girl of his choice before dinner that night. Well, a young man named Wesley Edwards discovered a red ear of corn, and he chose to kiss the wrong girl. You see, this girl was being courted by another boy, and that kiss would unfold a series of events that still haunts Appalachia to this very day. Now, Wesley Edwards was a member of one of the most powerful clans in the history of Appalachia, the Allen clan. The Allens had ruled these isolated mountains since the Civil War ended in the 1860s. They had been led by the Confederate Civil War veteran Jerry Allen, who, according to contemporary newspapers, was known for beating men to death with his own fist. Folks feared him, and he had become a leading citizen. That's right, the Allen clan was wealthy. Most of them lived in beautiful houses and owned huge amounts of land and owned successful general stores. Now, they were into politics too. They were proud, unreconstructed Southern Democrats in an otherwise largely Republican county. Most of the Allen family had held office, and for 50 years, they were known as Appalachian outlaws who settled disputes with fists and guns. By 1910, the patriarch of the clan was 54-year-old Floyd Allen, who was one of Jerry Allen's 7 children. Floyd was an imposing man with a bushy mustache who made his living as a shopkeeper and a farmer, and he was what you would expect of a leader of a clan. He was beloved by many, yet hated by others. He was known for both generosity and a quick temper. Floyd Allen had a long history of altercations with the law, but he had always gotten off with light sentences because of his political connections. For example, in 1904, he had been convicted of shooting his neighbor in a land dispute. Well, for that assault, the jury sentenced him to a $100 fine and 1 hour in jail. These type of sentences were common because folks feared the Allens would kill the judge or the jury if they convicted him. After Floyd Allen received a 1-hour jail sentence for shooting his neighbor, the Virginia governor, Andrew Jackson, pardoned him, and Floyd forced the man that he shot to pay the $100 fine or he'd shoot him again. In another altercation, Floyd and his brother Jack got into a shouting match over a dispute over their father's estate. Floyd shot Jack in the head, but the bullet bounced off of his skull. In return, Jack shot Floyd in the chest. Floyd fell back on a mattress, bleeding to death, when suddenly Jack felt sorry for him and he put down his gun. Floyd promptly pulled a pistol from underneath the mattress and emptied every bullet into his brother's chest. When he ran out of bullets, he got up and pistol whipped him. Floyd nearly died from the chest wound, but he eventually recovered. Most folks said that Floyd was just too mean to die. In his long life of violence, he had been shot 13 times in fights. Now, when Floyd shot his brother, he was again sentenced to a $100 fine and 1 hour in jail, but he just simply refused to go. Floyd bragged that he would never spend a minute in jail as long as the blood flowed through his veins. In fact, newspapers of the time claimed that the Allen family often boasted that no member of the Allen clan would ever see jail time. You see, it was a matter of family pride. The Allens even had federal officials scared of them. Once, a federal revenue agent showed Floyd a warrant to search his wagon for illegal moonshine. Upon inspecting the warrant, Floyd was reported to have said, "This paper entitles you to go into that wagon, but it don't say nothing about you coming out alive." Fearing for his life, the federal agent took the hint and left. Despite his record of lawlessness, Floyd Allen had been often deputized by the local law, and even in that role, there were many complaints against him for beating prisoners, nearly to death, who had tried to escape while he was their deputy. Simply put, Floyd Allen was one of the meanest, most violent men in a family of violent outlaws. They were untouchable. Everybody feared them. And the boy who kissed that girl at the corn shucking was Wesley Edwards, the nephew of Floyd Allen.
When I die, hallelujah, by and by, I'll fly away.
The very next day, after the corn shucking, during church services, Wesley Edwards ran into the boyfriend of the girl he kissed the night before. Now, that boy was furious, and he confronted Wesley. But as soon as church was over, Wesley and his brother took out their pistols. Then they took turns beating him nearly to death. Both of them were charged with felony assault and interfering with the worship service. Now, when Wesley's uncle Floyd Allen heard about the charges, he was furious, and he told the boys to hide out in North Carolina, where they couldn't be arrested, until he could make the officials drop the charges. However, a sheriff had a warrant drawn up, and they arrested the boys and ordered them extradited back. They hog-tied the boys up and tied them to the back of the wagon and began bringing them back to Virginia. Now, coincidentally, it just so happened that the road back into town passed right in front of Floyd Allen's house. When Floyd saw his nephews tied up like hogs, he demanded that they be released. But the deputies refused, and you see, that was a mistake. Floyd just promptly took out his pistol and beat the hell out of both of them. And then he simply untied his nephews. The next day, Floyd took both boys to court where they were convicted and served short sentences. However, Floyd now had a bigger problem. He himself was facing assault charges and illegal rescue of prisoners. It seems the sheriff and the local politicians had had enough of his vigilante justice, and now was the time to prove once and for all that they were the law of the land, not the powerful Allen clan. So you see, on March 13th, 1912, Floyd Allen found himself in court yet again for felony assault. This time, he was convicted on all charges and ordered to return to court the next day for sentencing. Word spread quickly throughout the town, and everybody knew there was sure to be trouble the next day. Heck, that evening, someone delivered a handwritten note to the judge that said, if Floyd is put in jail, they would kill the judge before sunset. The morning of March 14th, the entire town was on edge. Everybody knew something was looming. Every court official and every law enforcement officer in the building was carrying a pistol at the hearing. But so was the entire Allen clan, who were standing in the back of the courtroom, armed to the teeth. That's right, the entire courtroom was locked and loaded. Now, what happens next is still debated to this very day. But one thing is for certain, it would become the deadliest day in the history of the United States justice system. Floyd was seated in the defendant's chair in the middle of the courtroom when the lead juror read this sentence. We, the jury, find the defendant, Floyd Allen, guilty on all charges and recommend a $1,000 fine and 1 year in prison. A hush fell over the courtroom. Floyd slowly stood to his feet and he looked at the judge and he said, "Well, gentlemen, I ain't a-going." Nobody knows who fired the first shot, but all hell broke loose and the bullets began flying from all directions. In the next 90 seconds, gunfire rang out like thunder. Floyd was one of the first people shot and he fell to the ground on top of his lawyer who told him, "They're gonna kill me, shooting at you." Meanwhile, eyewitnesses said that the Allen clan stood at the back of the courtroom, firing pistols like Custer's cavalrymen at the Battle of Little Bighorn. They shot the jury foreman dead. The sheriff was shot 5 times and killed. The prosecuting attorney was killed. A 19-year-old onlooker was shot and killed. And the judge was shot dead right in his seat. Chaos broke out as folks ran for their lives. Floyd, who was already shot, pulled out a concealed pistol and he joined the battle. 7 other people were shot as the violence spilled out of the courtroom onto the lawn of the courthouse. The Allens took refuge behind a Confederate statue and they reloaded and continued the assault. Floyd's hip was shattered from a gunshot, but he managed to escape the courthouse where he was shot again by the court clerk. This time, shattered his knee. Although he was immobilized, Floyd continued firing back, and the court clerk was shot. All told, 5 people were dead and 7 more injured. Floyd was too badly injured to travel, so he hid out in a hotel, while the rest of the Allen clan escaped on horses. When they began pulling the dead bodies out of the courtroom, witnesses found a handwritten note still in the judge's pocket that read, "If you sentence Floyd Allen to jail, you'll be dead before sundown." Now, folks, that wasn't a threat. That was a fulfilled promise. 90 seconds of carnage left 57 bullet holes in the walls of the courtroom and the stairs leading out of the courthouse. Heck, 2 bullet holes in the courthouse steps are still there to this very day. The shootout made the front page of nearly every newspaper in the world. For the first time, the violence of Appalachian outlaws captivated the entire nation's attention as a nationwide manhunt ensued. Every member of the Allen clan was wanted, dead or alive. Now, the next morning, law enforcement captured Floyd at a nearby hotel since he was so badly wounded. When the cops burst into his room, Floyd was out of bullets, so he took a knife and tried to slit his own throat before being arrested. But catching the rest of the Allen clan would prove to be much more difficult. Several Allens hid in the mountains while others headed west. It would take months to catch them all. The last 2 Allens were finally caught 10 months later in Iowa. Ironically, the last Allen to be caught was Wesley Edwards, the man who had found the red ear of corn and planted the kiss that started it all. This event became known throughout the world as the Courthouse Massacre of 1912. It was front page news throughout the world for 30 days before another tragedy captured the world's attention when the Titanic struck an iceberg in the Atlantic Ocean and sank.
Hey guys, JD Phillips here, back with you on the Appalachian Storyteller Live. Glad you guys are hanging out with us tonight and listen to some stories and chatting and listen to some tunes. This next story I put out just a few days ago, maybe a week ago, and it's part of a series I'm doing about how Appalachia was shaped, and this is called How Logging Shaped Appalachia. Hope you enjoy it.
At the turn of the 20th century, the southern Appalachian Mountains were home to vast stands of virgin timber, including oak, hickory, poplar, and hemlock. The logging industry, which began to expand rapidly in the 19th century, targeted these valuable hardwoods for use in construction, furniture, and other industries. At the time, the logging industry was largely unregulated, and clear-cutting, a practice that involved cutting down all the trees in an area, was common. The logging industry had a significant impact on the families and the communities of southern Appalachia. The forests of Appalachia, which covered parts of Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, were rich in timber. And the logging industry developed rapidly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This was one of the first industries to provide employment for the many families in the region. But the work was often dangerous and low-paying. Logging companies relied on labor from the local population, and many Appalachian families depended on the industry for their livelihood. However, the work was often seasonal and irregular, with long periods of unemployment between logging seasons. The scrip system was a form of currency that was only valid within the company-owned town or company store, and it wasn't accepted anywhere else. Under this scrip system, logging companies would pay their workers with paper or metal tokens that could be used to purchase goods and services from the company store. Now, these tokens didn't have any intrinsic value, and they weren't legal money, but they could be exchanged for company goods and services. Now, this scrip system had several disadvantages for workers. First, the value of the tokens was set by the company, and it wasn't always equivalent to the real value of money. This meant that the workers could be paid less than they were owed for their labor. And second, because these tokens were only valid at the company store, the workers had no choice but to buy goods from the company at the prices set by that same company. This meant that workers had little control over their own finances, and they were often trapped in debt to these companies. Oh, it was a vicious cycle. This scrip system was widely used in the logging industry in southern Appalachia prior to the 1940s, but it was also used in other industries such as coal mining. Now, this system, it began to decline in the 1930s and 40s as labor laws were enacted to protect workers' rights, and more workers began to organize and demand fair wages and better working conditions. The impact of the logging industry on the environment was significant. Clear cutting was a logging technique in which all the trees of an area were cut down, and unfortunately, this was very common in southern Appalachia. The loss of the forest cover also increased the risk of flooding and other natural disasters. In addition, the logging industry disrupted traditional ways of life for many families in the region. You see, the forest had long been an important source of food and medicine and other resources for people, and the rapid pace of logging led to the depletion of these resources. So while the logging industry provided employment for the many families in southern Appalachia, it had many negative impacts on the environment and the traditional ways of life. By removing most of the trees, the habitat for wildlife was destroyed and the local ecosystems were disrupted. It also increased soil erosion and runoff, which led to sedimentation and pollution of streams and rivers. As a result, the water quality of many streams and rivers was severely damaged, which had negative impacts on the aquatic life, and in many cases, it made the water unfit for human consumption. In addition to the environmental impacts, the logging industry also had significant social and economic impacts on the region. While it provided many jobs for the local residents, it also created significant economic disparities between the landowners who profited from the logging operations and the laborers who worked in the mills and the logging camps. Many of these workers were immigrants or descendants of immigrants who had come to the United States seeking economic opportunities. Yet, they were paid low wages and worked under dangerous and difficult conditions. The owners of these logging operations created company towns, which were owned and operated by the companies themselves. These towns were often isolated and lacked basic services such as health care, education, and infrastructure. That's right, and they were designed to provide a captive labor force for the logging industry. And because the workers couldn't spend their money anywhere else, these companies had these folks right where they wanted them. This led to a vicious cycle of debt and dependency, and it was very difficult to escape. Despite these negative impacts, the logging industry played a critical role in the economic development of Appalachia. It provided jobs and economic opportunities for many people, and it helped to spur the development of transportation infrastructure, such as the railroads and the roads, and it made it easier to access and transport natural resources. However, by the 1920s, it was becoming clear that the logging industry was not sustainable. Many of the old-growth forests had been depleted, and the industry was increasingly turning to second-growth forests, which were less valuable and more difficult to access. In response to these challenges, a number of conservative groups and government agencies began to advocate for the protection of the southern Appalachian Mountains. These efforts culminated in the establishment of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in 1934. This was the first national park in the eastern United States. The park, which straddles the border between Tennessee and North Carolina, was designed to protect the natural and cultural resources of the region, including its forests and its wildlife and the cultural heritage. The establishment of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park marked a turning point in the history of southern Appalachia. It represented a shift away from the unregulated exploitation of natural resources and towards the conservation and the preservation of these resources for future generations. Today, the southern Appalachian Mountains are home to a thriving tourist industry which celebrates the natural beauty and the cultural heritage of the region. While the legacy of the logging industry is still visible in the form of scars on the landscape and in the memories of those who worked in the industry, it is also clear that the region has undergone a significant transformation in the past century, and the future of our mountains is hopeful.
Hey guys, JD Phillips back here with you on the Appalachian Storyteller Live. Our next story comes to us from West Virginia, Greenbrier County, West Virginia. Matter of fact, this is one of my favorite stories, and it's a powerful story. There's literally, so we were driving through West Virginia, and I ran across this sign, this historical marker on the side of the road, and it literally was talking about the only case in the United States judicial system where the testimony of a ghost in court convicted a murderer. And it just blew me away. And so I researched this whole story, and it was about a lady named Zona. And I even went to Zona's grave and sat there for about 30 minutes at her gravesite looking for inspiration, if you will, for this story. This is an awesome story. Hold on for this one. This is called The Greenbrier Ghost.
During the 1890s, superstition and the existence of ghosts was widely accepted as a natural fact in the Appalachian Mountains. After all, it was during this time that the Ouija board first began selling all across America, and nearly everyone was under the alluring spell of spiritualism. Now, whether or not you believe in ghosts, it's a fact that in 1897, a ghost entered the official law books in West Virginia. That's right, and it's the only known case in history where the testimony of a ghost led to the conviction of a murderer. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh, heck, there ain't no way that's a bunch of hogwash. Well, my friend, prepare yourself for the remarkable, true story of the Greenbrier Ghost. Our story begins in the fall of 1896 in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. All of the ladies in this small community were abuzz with curiosity due to a tall young man who had just rolled into town. Local gossip was that Edward Shue had come to Greenbrier to work at a local blacksmith shop. Now, Edward was a towering, handsome man with ocean blue, deep-set eyes and a chiseled jaw, with thick, lush brown hair and broad shoulders. He was extremely strong, muscular, and flashed a quick smile that made him a natural ladies' man. It wasn't long before he caught the attention of a beautiful 20-year-old woman named Zona Hester. She was free-spirited and untamed, with a willowy face, long silk-like hair, and molasses brown eyes. Both Edward and Zona were instantly attracted to each other, and a whirlwind courtship soon followed. Now, many folks warned Zona not to move too fast with Edward. Besides, just where did this fella come from, and who knew what his mysterious and unknown past might be hiding? Yet, Zona had a rebellious spirit. Heck, she already had a child out of wedlock 2 years earlier when she was 18. So, despite concerns from her mother and others, Zona and Edward were married in November of 1896, within just a couple months of meeting each other at the old Methodist church at Livesay's Mill. The young couple seemed to be living a happy life together. They settled into a small 2-story home just on the other side of Sewell Mountain from Zona's childhood home, 14 miles away, where her mother still lived. Edward spent his days working hard, forging horseshoes in front of the open fire at the local blacksmith shop. Zona spent her days tending to household chores and cooking meals for her husband. The Christmas of 1896 came and went, and by all appearances, they were happy, and they had a long future in front of them. However, not all things are always as they seem from the outside. and there were long, cold winter months that lay ahead. It's only so long that a man can keep a secret past hidden in these mountains. Just who had Zona married, and what was he really hiding behind those dark eyes? By January 1897, Zona and Edward Shue had been married for just over 3 months when Zona suddenly took sick. For several weeks, she was under the care of Dr. J.M. Knapp, who visited her house regularly to check on her. Edward appeared to be very attentive to his young bride's needs. He even hired an 11-year-old boy named Andy Jones to drop by the house each day and help out with the housework and tend to their animals. On the morning of January 22nd, Edward stopped at Andy's cabin on the way to his blacksmith shop, and he asked the boy if he would go and attend to some chores for Zona. However, Andy had already committed to go to work for a local doctor that day. Edward seemed a little irritated by this. As the morning went on, there were 4 separate times that Edward went back to Andy's house and kept asking him to go check on Zona before the young boy finally agreed. Now, what I'm about to tell you is word for word what Andy said happened when he got to Zona's house, the same way he told this story 70 years later in his life. When I got to the house, I felt that something was wrong. All the doors were closed, and there was an air about the place that I just didn't like. When I got to the steps, I looked down and I saw a trail of blood, and it scared me. But I got the courage up and I went to the door and I knocked. No one answered. There was nothing but silence. I tried the doorknob and it was unlocked. So I slowly opened the door and I walked into the kitchen. The trail of blood continued across the kitchen floor, all the way to the dining room door, which was also closed. Once again, I knocked on the door. "Miss Shue, are you in there?" But nobody answered. So I opened the door and I walked in, and as soon as I did, I stumbled over something. When I hit the ground, I realized I was on top of Miss Shue's body. There she was, stretched out on the floor, looking right up at me through wide open eyes. Her face was frozen in time, and she appeared to be laughing. I was scared to death, but I was still able to reach down and shake her. And when I touched her, she was cold and stiff. I bolted out of that house running as fast as I could. I called across the field to Aunt Martha. "Miss Sue is dead! Miss Sue is dead!" Aunt Martha started running to the house to check on Miss Sue, while I ran to the blacksmith shop to tell Mr. Sue. When I told him what I found, he yelled, and with his boss, they both started for the house while I ran on to get Dr. Knapp. By the time the doctor and I arrived back to the house, Mr. Sue had taken his wife from the floor, placed her on a bed, and he was holding her head in his arms, crying for her to come back. But the strangest thing of all, although nobody thought about it at the time, was that he had already dressed Miss Sue in a long gown for her funeral, placing one of those old-fashioned high, stiff collars around her neck and holding it in place with some kind of scarf. Dr. Knapp immediately started investigating to determine if Miss Sue was still alive, and throughout his efforts to revive the woman, Mr. Sue continued to hold her head, refusing to let the doctor examine it. Oh, but the doctor felt awful for Edward, and he could see that this man had just lost his entire life as he held Zona in his arms. Finally, the doctor turned and said, "It's everlasting faint. Her heart has failed."
I've been on this gospel way for many, many days. But I know it won't be long till I am gone.
The very next morning, Zona's body, accompanied by her husband and several neighbors, was taken back over the mountain to her mother's home. And within 24 hours, she was buried in the little family graveyard high up on the side of the mountain. Indeed, Edward was devastated by the loss of Zona. The entire time leading up to the funeral, he never once left his dead wife's side in the presence of others. Before they put Zona's body in a coffin, he wouldn't let anyone else go near her, not even her mother. He stood the entire time near Zona's head, crying and sobbing and moaning and wailing. To make Zona more comfortable, he said, he folded a sheet on both sides of her head. Now, folks began talking about Edward's grief. Many folks admired the love and the tender care that he showed his wife after her death. Others weren't so convinced. After all, it was the custom during those days for women to care for the body of a deceased wife, to wash it and dress it for the funeral. Why had Edward done these things himself? Was this everlasting love, or something more sinister? Zona's death hit her mother hard. They were literally best friends. Her daughter had only been married for just a few months, and now she was dead. Heck, her mother had never even had a chance to visit Edward and Zona's home. Everything was so sudden, and there were no answers. However, this wasn't the end of the story, and what happens next is still talked about 130 years later. In the weeks after Zona's funeral, her mother, Mary Hester, couldn't seem to get over the death of her daughter. She leaned heavily on her faith in the Lord, and she prayed daily to Him to reveal the cause of Zona's death. About a month later, Mary was kneeling next to her bed, praying for answers, when she felt a strange presence enter the room. Now, she wasn't sleeping or dreaming. She was wide awake. She looked up, and she saw an aura in the doorway that began to take the shape of a human. Mary's heart was racing, and chills ran down her spine as the spirit transformed into Zona right before her eyes. Mary was speechless, and she reached out to fill Zona's coffin, but she wasn't in a coffin anymore. Zona reached her hand towards her mother, and she opened her mouth to say something, but then she suddenly vanished. The very next day, Mary remained in constant, non-stop prayer when suddenly Zona appeared before her again. This time, she told her mother all about the home that her and Edward lived in. She disclosed small details about the cellar, the closets, the attic. All sorts of details that only someone who lived there would know. Now Mary, she had never even visited the home. Yet now, she knew every detail about the home Zona was living in. Zona told her mother to rest, and she would return the next day. Sure enough, on the third day, Zona appeared again to her mother. However, she didn't want to discuss the home anymore. This time she talked about her husband, Edward. She told her mother that he was a very violent man, and he had abused her many times. She warned her mother that Edward had been married twice before, and he had beat both of his previous wives. His second wife had mysteriously died, just like Zona. Mary begged Zona to tell her what happened to her. "Not yet, Mother," she said. "I will return tomorrow. I have something to show you." On the fourth day, Zona appeared to Mary for a final time. Zona began sharing exactly what happened the day she died. "Mama, I spent all morning cleaning the house and cooking all afternoon for Edward. But this time when he came home, he was angry again, like many nights before. He began yelling at me that I hadn't cooked any meat for supper. I told him that I cooked everything we had, and there was plenty. We had bread and butter, applesauce, preserves, and other things that make up a fine, good supper. After I was finished speaking, he flew into a rage and he got up and he came towards me. When I raised up, he seized each side of my head with his hands, and with a sudden wrench, he broke my neck and dragged my body to the foot of the stairs and left me there. "Now, Mama, I have something to show you," Zona said. And with that, Zona spun her entire head around 180 degrees, like a scene out of The Exorcist, to prove that her neck was broken. She disappeared and never returned again. Mary now knew that Edward had murdered Zona, just like he had murdered his first wife, and she couldn't let him get away with it. She spent the next several days telling anyone who would listen to her what Zona had told her. At first, most folks just thought she was a grieving mother and just acting out in sorrow. However, some folks believed her enough to arrange a meeting between Mary and the Greenbrier County prosecuting office. Mary spent the entire day telling the prosecutor what Zona had told her, and they summoned the doctor who had examined Zona and determined her cause of death. The doctor admitted that he hadn't really fully examined Zona because he felt sorry for her grieving husband as he held her body. Armed with this new circumstantial evidence, the prosecutor summoned Edward and the doctor, and they decided to do something unthinkable. That's right. They headed to the graveyard to dig up Zona's body. But what would they find? The next morning, the three men walked into the foggy graveyard, armed with shovels, and began digging until they reached Zona's coffin. They loaded her casket on the back of a wagon, and they took it to a nearby one-room schoolhouse, where they opened the coffin up, and they began the gruesome task of examining the body. The prosecutor forced Edward to stay in the room with Zona's body as the doctor examined it for the next 3 days. For the most part, Edward sat in the corner, whittling on sticks with his pocket knife as the doctor performed the examination. However, once the doctors began removing the collar from Zona's neck, Edward became noticeably anxious. There was bruising on her neck, consistent with fingers being wrapped around her neck. Her windpipe was crushed, and it was obvious that the first and second vertebrae in her neck were broken in the exact place that Zona's ghost said it was. Edward was immediately placed under arrest and charged with the murder of Zona.
Hey guys, JD Phillips back here with you. A lot of these videos that I do a lot of the music in them myself. And a lot of times I use a lot of scenes in transitions where you'll see a cross on top of a church that I film with a drone. And I'll play this song called Just a Twinkling of an Eye. And I have so many people ask me about this song. Probably people ask me more about this song than anything else. I'm going to play just a little bit of it for you. This is called Just a Twinkling of an Eye. Or is it Just a Twinkling of the Eye, I think. I've been on this gospel way for many, many days. I know it won't be long till I am gone. And if the Lord should come tonight, I'll be on a one-way flight just a twinkling of the eye away from home. Our next story comes to us from outside of the Great Smoky Mountains. And there's this old one-room schoolhouse there. And I think a lot of people have fascinations with those type of buildings. But this one is stunning. And I've never seen one like it. And it's on somebody's private property in the middle of a cow pasture. And it's just got this gorgeous bell tower on it, and the biggest sassafras tree growing out of the side of it that I think I've ever seen. Anyways, I stumbled upon this place, and then I started trying to do research on it, and I couldn't find anything on it. The only thing I could find on Google was people all over the world selling paintings of this schoolhouse. So if you look it up, it's called the Island View Schoolhouse. There are paintings everywhere from all kinds of well-known painters. And I think there was a kind of a B movie made there, kind of a low-budget movie there that actually I think is going to be released in 2023. But I went through the county property records, and I found out the man who owned it. And then I went all over the internet, and I found his address, and then I found his cell phone number, and I took a shot in the dark, and I sent him a text and said, "Hey, I'm J.D. Phillips, and I'd like to do a story on that schoolhouse that's sitting out in your pasture." And we made it. He's an old guy, and we met. He let me in there, and he told me the entire history of it. And he had preserved this house, this schoolhouse, he preserved it, and because his mother graduated there. And this is a great story. A lot of twists and turns in it that you wouldn't really expect. But I asked him, I said, "Why don't you get this thing put on the historic National Register of Historic Places?" And he said, "Well, I don't want the government controlling anything that was my mama's." And this is the Island View Schoolhouse. I hope you enjoy it.
I often take back roads instead of highways and interstates whenever I have the choice. For me, I prefer the two-lane roads and the rolling hills and open fields and beautiful old barns. There's a sense of timelessness that I feel as I travel these country roads in Appalachia. Now, it might be just my imagination, but it seems my heart rate is more relaxed and the stresses of the modern world just seem to fade away. If only just for a moment, as I travel 40 miles an hour, seemingly alone on these isolated roads. I often find myself imagining the history of the old buildings that are scattered throughout these rural areas in the Appalachian Mountains, far removed from the fast pace of suburban and urban life. Recently, I saw a picture taken from the road of an abandoned one-room schoolhouse named Island View School, sitting in the middle of a cow pasture in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains National Park. It had over 1,000 likes on social media and hundreds of comments from folks all over the world wondering what its history was. Many folks said they drove by it every day or they lived down the road from it, but yet most of them didn't know the history or how or when it got there. So I started researching. I found dozens of paintings of the school and hundreds of photos. Yet, there was something inside of me that needed to know what the story of the school was. And before long, I had located the owner of the cow pasture and I reached out to him. Now, out of respect to his privacy, I'll just call him by his first name, John. I explained to John that I love sharing the history of these Appalachian Mountains with a dedicated core of people on this YouTube channel who are just as passionate about learning and preserving our history as I am. John agreed to grant access to me to film this historic building and to share its rich history with me. So with that, here's the complete story of the Island View Schoolhouse. Our story begins in 1895. That's when 2 acres of land was purchased for $34 to build this school for children in this rural area. The name of the school was Cowan School. This modest school stood until early one morning in 1917. That's when a little girl named Pauline Lau woke up in her bed after a large commotion to find that she was soaking wet. She quickly yelled out to her father, "Dad, come quick, it's raining in my room." Indeed, the roof had been blown off the house by a tornado, and once the storm passed, they quickly realized that the school had been completely destroyed by the tornado. So, the community set out to build a new school, one much nicer than the one destroyed by the storm. So they secured $558.92 to build the Island View School in 1917. Oh, this school was amazing. A one-room schoolhouse that housed grades 1 through 8, all in the same room. It contained all the conveniences of modern life. It had a wood stove heater, a separate boys and girls outhouse, and separate areas to store their coats and their books. Heck, it even had a handmade chalkboard that was made with the paint from the ashes of Irish potatoes mixed with water. They dug a 12-foot well next to the schoolhouse with a pump for the kids to wash their hands and to drink their water. The crown jewel of this school was the bell sitting high above the roof line to call the children to school each day. Yes, sir, this was a fine educational establishment. It had a school principal, a teacher, and a janitor. Oh, well, I mean one teacher did all 3 jobs at the same time. The community chose the name Island View School since there was a huge hill behind the schoolhouse where you could see an island sitting in the middle of the French Broad River, located nearly a half-mile away. Kids walked, rode horses, or carpooled in wagons each day to the school. The school year was always centered around the crop season, and the classes were always canceled during harvest season so the kids could help in the fields. Indeed, these were good times at Island View School. However, in the late 1940s, another local school burned down and students were forced to move into Island View while a new school was built. So you see, they just put a curtain right down the middle of the class at Island View and made 2 classrooms. Once the new school was built, it was called Boyd Creek School, and all of the students from Island View were bused there. And just like that, the walls of Island View School that were once filled with the sounds of children went silent. The building sat abandoned in the middle of a cow pasture for the next 55 years, slowly falling in on itself. The rear wall collapsed and the cows began just walking right inside of the school and chewing holes in the blackboards. Heck, the school was even used to store bales of hay. And the small sassafras tree that had been planted in front of the school decades ago by school children began growing into the building. Indeed, the building was nearly lost to time. Now, hold on now, that's not the end of the story. Oh yeah, you remember the little girl back at the beginning of the story that woke up after the tornado and it was raining in her room back in 1917? You know, Pauline Lau? Well, you see, 90 years later, in 2007, her son, Sam Lau, and her son-in-law, John, began restoring this building, and together, they saved the historic Island View School from the hands of time. That's right, the same man who was gracious enough to share the story of the school with me is one of the very men who saved the school. Since then, they've held reunions with many of the original Island View School children visiting the school. There's even an upcoming Hollywood movie, Marbles and Bullets, that was filmed inside of the school. Every time the owner opens the gate to the pasture to check on his cows or visit the school, Folks stop along the road wanting to take a closer look at this beautiful Appalachian schoolhouse. So, if you ever find yourself riding the back roads along Boyd's Creek Road in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains, you'll see this beautiful one-room schoolhouse standing in the middle of the pasture, sitting silently. Take a moment and ponder, what would these walls say if they could talk? Would they tell stories of a stern teacher? Or would they tell stories of silly school children, stories of lost homework, and lifelong friendships that were made within these walls? If you listen closely enough, would you hear the sounds of children playing and giggles echoing through the wind? Can you still hear the ringing of the bell, signaling the beginning of a new school day? And that, my friends, is the true history of the Island View Schoolhouse. I'm glad I took time to stop and learn this history before it was forever lost to time.
Hey guys, JD Phillips from the Appalachian Storyteller again. Hope you guys are enjoying the tunes and the stories tonight, and the background information that you just won't find in the videos. Please help support this channel by hitting that like button and sharing this video out on your social media. I'd really appreciate that. Thank you so much for your support. I want to play another song for you by one of my favorite artists. This is Jamie Johnson, and it's a song called In Color. And it talks about, you know, I think a lot of us have photos somewhere in a photo album or somewhere put up, maybe some black and white ones, old worn photos, and just the stories that those photos, particularly black and white photos, the story that the shades of gray keep covered. This is called In Color. I said, Grandpa, what's this picture here? It's all black and white. It ain't real clear, is that you there? He said, yeah, I was 11. And times were tough back in 35. That's me and Uncle Joe trying to survive a cotton farm in the Great Depression. And if it looks like we were scared to death, like a couple of kids trying to save each other, you should have seen it in color. And this one here was taken overseas in the middle of hell, 1943, in the wintertime. You can almost see my breath. That was my tail gunner, old Johnny McGee. He was a high school teacher from East Tennessee, and he had my back right through the day we left. If it looks like we were scared to death, like a couple of kids trying to save each other,
should have seen it in color. Yeah, a picture's worth 1,000 words, but you can't see what those shades of gray keep covered. Should have seen it in color. This one here is my favorite one. This is me and me, Mom. The summer sun, all dressed up. The day we set our vows. You can't tell it here, but it was hot that June. That rose is red, her eyes were blue. Look at that smile, I was so proud. That's the story of my life. Right there in black and white. And if it looks like we were scared to death, like a couple of kids trying to save each other, should have seen it in color. Yeah, a picture's worth 1,000 words, but you can't see what those shades of gray keep covered. Should have seen it in color.
Boy, that's a special song. All right, so another story here. Did you know that Knoxville, Tennessee seems to be a sort of Bermuda Triangle, if you will, for musicians? Now, I live near that area, but I was smart enough to at least be 20 miles outside of this triangle. But it seems that musicians who perform there meet an untimely fate. What do you think? Is it real? Well, watch this and let me know what you think.
Now, folks living in the Appalachian Mountains have long known that there are things that happen deep in these backwoods that just can't be explained by modern science. Indeed, there are countless folklores and legends that describe mysterious beings, disappearances, witches, curses, and supernatural forces. Many folks claim that there are entire towns and cities in these mountains that are cursed and have been for hundreds of years. That's right. Places that possess some unknown force that only the brave or the foolish dare trespass. Believe it or not, one such city is Knoxville, Tennessee. You know, the one with the strange landmark standing in the skyline that looks just like a microphone. And for the past 100 years, musicians have mysteriously died right after performing or visiting this city. Names like Elvis Presley, Hank Williams, Janis Joplin, George Jones, Randy Rhoads, and many others have mysteriously met their fate with destiny after visiting this city. Now, while some may brush this off as a coincidence, others swear that this city is cursed, and any musician performing there is risking their very lives by doing so. So, being a musician myself, I thought I'd do some snooping around and find out exactly what's behind the musical curse of Knoxville. The curse can be traced back to February 17, 1943. That's when the Russian composer Sergei Rachmaninoff, the world's greatest concert pianist at the time, traveled all the way to Knoxville to put on a concert for a small select audience at the University of Tennessee. Now, he didn't know it, but this would be the last performance of his life. Everything appeared to go smoothly. However, once he got on a train to try to leave Knoxville, he instantly fell gravely ill. And on his deathbed, he told his family that he knew in his heart something had happened to him in Knoxville and ended his life. Now, after he died, none of his students would dare set foot in Knoxville. The city felt so bad about his death that they erected the only statue of Rachmaninoff that exists in the world, and it still stands today in downtown Knoxville. And of course, they placed the statue right underneath the microphone in downtown, like a trophy case on display. Did the musical curse of Knoxville kill Rachmaninoff? Do you need more proof? December 30th, 1952. Country music superstar Hank Williams was just 29 years old and in the prime of his life. He rolled into Knoxville and he checked into the Andrew Johnson Hotel at 7 o'clock p.m. Now you have to keep in mind that this hotel itself has an ominous history, all of its own, and folks mysteriously die after staying there, including Amelia Earhart. Hank suddenly fell ill right after he checked in. He ordered room service and began having mild convulsions, so a doctor was summoned. The doctor injected Hank with some morphine mixed with vitamin B12, yet there was no improvement. Hank's manager and assistants ignored his erratic breathing and the rattling they heard coming from the singer, and instead they carried him out to the back seat of his brand new 1952 Cadillac, and they left Knoxville 3 hours later. Within the next hour, the Cadillac was pulled over by the Highway Patrol for reckless driving, where a lifeless Hank Williams was discovered in the back seat. However, his manager convinced the officer that Hank had just passed out from too much drinking. They drove on for nearly 24 hours until they stopped for breakfast. Hank's manager pulled the coat off of Hank, and his hands were ice cold, and when he tried to move them, they snapped back into place. They rushed him to the hospital in the small Appalachian town of Oak Hill, West Virginia. The doctor took one look at Hank and said, "Well, he's dead." The truth is, he never left Knoxville alive. Did the musical curse of Knoxville kill Hank? Do you still think it's a coincidence? You need more proof, you say. All right, have it your way. March 19th, 1982. Superstar rock and roll guitarist Randy Rhoads was at the height of his fame at 25 years old as the lead guitarist for legendary rocker Ozzy Osbourne. Rhoads blended his classical roots with an unprecedented metal flair. He was arguably the greatest rock and roll guitarist of all time. He and Ozzy performed what would be their last show together to a sold-out crowd of over 6,000 roaring fans in Knoxville at the Civic Coliseum. The concert was an amazing show, and the band loaded their tour bus right after performing the last song of the night, Suicide Solution. However, mysteriously, the air conditioning on the bus stopped working the moment they tried to leave Knoxville, and the heat was too much to take inside of the bus, so they pulled over to get the AC fixed. While they were waiting, most of the band was asleep on the bus when Rhoads was talked into taking a joyride on a small 1955 airplane with a pilot who didn't have a license. Even though Randy was afraid of heights, he got on the plane. In the middle of the flight, the pilot decided to buzz the tour bus to wake up the band. The wing of the plane clipped the bus and sent the small plane spiraling out of control, and it crashed and exploded into a house. What made the tour bus stop once it left Knoxville? And what possessed Randy Rhoads to get on that plane? Was it the Knoxville music curse, or just another coincidence? April 6, 2013, country music legend George Jones was performing a show at the Knoxville Civic Coliseum on his farewell tour. The show appeared to go smoothly, and the singer sang his last song, He Stopped Loving Her Today, and walked off stage. He immediately turned to his wife Nancy, and he gave an ominous prediction. "Honey, I think I just did my last show, and I gave 'em hell," the singer said. And he was right. He was soon rushed to the hospital, where he remained for the next 20 days until he died. Still just a coincidence? Now, other musicians have appeared to escape the music curse of Knoxville, only to meet their demise a short time later. Consider this. Janis Joplin performed in Knoxville on November 8, 1969, and she would be dead 8 months later. The king himself, Elvis Presley, last performed in Knoxville on May 20th, 1977. He sang his last song of the concert, How Great Thou Art, yet Presley would be dead in less than 3 months. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a pretty impressive list of musicians who met their demise in Knoxville. Rachmaninoff, Hank Williams, George Jones, rock legend Randy Rhoads, Janis Joplin, and Elvis Presley. Do you believe that it's a coincidence that so many legends had their careers ended in these mountains of East Tennessee? Or is there something more to this? Are the mountains of Knoxville cursed for all the musicians who dare set foot in this city? Well, I know of at least one place that I won't be performing anytime soon.